not live.
I will do. For you, I will do that, David.
Yeah, we're now live, guys. Okay. David Oliver, you kicking off? David?
Use my phone if you want.
Do you want to unmute Phil? Do you want to unmute Pam first of all before David?
I've just asked to unmute Pam, so Pam, you should be able to come off mute now. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'll go on mute.
Okay, I'll mute. David, take it away.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. We welcome Pam Fox, and the title is Using Memories and Stories to Bring 20th Century Jewish History Alive. Pam is a social historian. She studied politics and history at university, and she has a PhD in social history. Her main career was as a chief officer in local government, and then as a senior civil servant in central government. She is very involved in Jewish affairs and has a particular interest in Jewish social history. Her history of the Jewish community of Golders Green has been published by the History Press. She is now working as a researcher and writer specializing in Jewish social history. She recently completed a book on the Rinkoff Jewish Bakery in London's East End, who I believe there's a few Rinkoffs here as well. Now, Pam loves questions, so please don't be shy. The best way is to click on the participants box and then on the hand wave, or write in the chat box. But please don't wave because we don't really see you when you do wave. So over to you, Pam.
Thank you very much for that introduction and also for the invitation to speak, David. I've been really looking forward to this. I've now been writing Jewish history books for over 10 years. And I've been developing this specialism of using what's called oral history interviews to tell Jewish history. And in the years that I've been writing, I've become more and more convinced about how effective stories, anecdotes, tales, memories are for telling Jewish history. For me, it really brings Jewish history alive. It makes it exciting and entertaining. It also, I think, brings out nuances and dimensions that traditional ways of writing history doesn't do. I think most important of all, though, is the fact that it helps people to engage with Jewish history. I think more than anything that I've ever written, these books using memories and stories help people get in touch with our very rich Jewish heritage. I think it's particularly relevant for Jewish history using oral history materials because of the stories that Jews have to tell, because of things that Jews have experienced, the journeys they've had. There's lots for Jews to say. And so this particular technique really, really works. I think it also works for modern Jewish history. By that I mean kind of the last century up to date, really, because there are people around who you can still talk to. Obviously, you can't go back further than sort of early 20th century, but as a technique, it really works for modern Jewish history. I've now written 5 books which have mainly been based, not exclusively, but mainly been based on oral history interviews. The most recent of them literally goes off to the publishers next week, and I'll be talking about that book. I'm going to go through each of the books in turn, talking about where they came from, what they're about, how I used oral history material, and some of the challenges and learning experiences. I'm going to talk about the first two of the books in less detail, but concentrate a bit more on the three latest ones, because I think they may be more interesting to you as a particular audience. I will also be interspersing them at various places with examples of some of the anecdotes and stories that appear. And at this point, I would like to introduce my husband, Michael Hart, who has kindly offered, in inverted commas, to be my reader. So when we get to the point of telling stories, Michael will be my narrator, and I think it'll be perhaps a bit more interesting for you to have a break from my voice all of the time. David, I think that at various points, when I get to the end of each book, you'll be asking me some questions, which will be great. But as you said at the beginning, I'd really welcome people to chip in at any time if they want to ask any questions, or better still, if they want to share some memories that my talk may trigger for them. Right, so I'm going to start with a book called A Place to Call My Jewish Home, which was my first foray into oral history. It was commissioned by the Liberal Jewish Synagogue in St. John's Wood back in 2010, as it was coming up to its 100th anniversary. And the book was commissioned as part of its 100-year celebrations. When I was asked to have a look at existing material, I saw that there had been, over the years, some interviews being carried out, but some of them were quite short, and they did tend to be what I'd call the great and the good, rather than a cross-section of the membership of the synagogue. So I carried out about another 50 interviews to get a much representative sample of people talking to me. The material that I collected was used both to tell the story of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, but over half of the book was dedicated to what I call mini biographies of a cross-section of members. And I still remember being quite sort of taken by the quite high profile and in some cases illustrious career of some of the members of the synagogue. But even more important to me was the theme that emerged about how many of the members had during their life dedicated time, effort to social action, voluntary activities. It was a huge theme. And if I might just illustrate that by reference to one particular woman who I interviewed, somebody called Margaret Regal, who was a very prominent member of the synagogue, but also she had a lifelong experience of social work, principally in the East End. But more latterly, she became very well known for being one of the co-founders of the women's action on the refuseniks, the Soviet Jewry, which was known as the 35s group. I don't know how many people knew about this particular organization, but they were very, very high profile, and they made a lot of difference in terms of helping the refuseniks in Russia. But she was just one example of the sort of life that people had led that I talked to. So, David, your question. Are you there, David?
Okay, here we're back again. Sorry. This was your first Jewish history book using stories and memories. What did you learn from writing the book?
Yeah, there was a lot of learning because it's both my first Jewish history book and my first oral history book, and spadefuls of learning. But I think the thing that sticks out most is the fact that people remember the same events and the same occurrences in totally different ways. If you interview 10 people, they all tell you a quite different story about the same thing. And just to give you an example of that, in the front lobby of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, there's an installation by Anish Kapoor, which is a Holocaust Memorial. And there are about 10 people claimed individual responsibility for both commissioning and overseeing the installation of that particular Holocaust Memorial. And I remember quite vividly, and probably Michael does as well, is one Sunday lunchtime, we went to a luncheon, a rather large luncheon, and there were people squabbling all the time about whose responsibility it was for the Anish Kapoor statue at the LJS. So that's just an example of how people remember things quite differently.
Okay. What as your first book? What sort of people bought and read the book?
In short, people, they were not the people who I expected. When I was commissioned to write the book, I really thought it would be a book that would largely be read by members of the synagogue, both past and present, a really kind of a communal history. And I was very surprised to be asked to speak at Jewish Book Week in 2012 about the book. And it did get quite a big audience there. Though I have to be brutally honest that I think the fact that I was being interviewed by Michael Grade had something to do with the large audience, as much as it had to do about the story of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue. Seemed to be quite a lot of people flocking around when I was signing books to speak to Michael Grade as well as to me. Interestingly, and I've never really got to the bottom of this, is that it also sold really well in America. I don't know why the interest was from the American audience. And the other thing which I hadn't anticipated was how it would be used in terms of the congregation. Rather sadly, quite a big proportion of the people who were interviewed for the book are no longer with us. And various rabbis have used the stories about people to draft the eulogies at the funerals for those people who've subsequently died. I hadn't really anticipated that would be one of the uses of the book.
Okay. Right. Any questions? No?
Nothing at the moment, no.
Nothing at the moment. Okay, she'll carry on with the next one.
Is a sort of spin-off from that first book, A Place to Call My Jewish Home. I wrote a book that was called 50 Years Out and About, which was the 50-year history of a club for people with disabilities that met at the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, but was actually very cross-denominational in terms of who got involved, and also very multi-faith in terms of the people who came to the club. Its claim to fame is that one of the founders was Esther Ransom, who subsequently became the president for quite a while. I interviewed people and trained other people in this instance to interview both current members of the club, past members, volunteers through its 50-year history, other people who had a part to play, such as drivers, people who'd entertained at the club, etc. And it produced a very, very rich history. I think I saw somewhere in the audience Diana DaCosta, who was one of the very first chairs of the Out and About Club, and she may want to add to the experience of the book and what came out of the oral history experience. Or any questions from you, David?
Okay. What? That's strange. What's what did you most enjoy about writing this particular book?
I think that as a sort of with a background as a social historian, I was very taken with the emerging story of disability and the social history of disability, and how both the nature of disability and society's reaction to it changed over a 50-year period. At the beginning, a lot of the members of the club were people who'd had polio, who were wheelchair bound because of things like hip problems or knee problems. But today, those kind of things are both kind of avoidable and curable. And today, the membership of the club is largely people who are generally frail rather than suffering from those kind of disabilities that we saw at the beginning of the period. However, having said that in a kind of professional capacity, that interest, as an individual, I was much more taken with the quite awe-inspiring stories of some of the people who'd been members of the club in the past and of current members. It sticks out for me. Some of the early members were 3 people who used to turn up to meetings on their, do people remember the blue mobility tricycles, the little cars that people used to have to get around? And they sort of arrived in tandem and parked on the forecourt of the synagogue, and they were real characters. Apparently their driving was atrocious, and there was sort of police alert went out on a Tuesday evening when they were coming, and they were quite characters. One of the women had worked for Mossbros, and her Yiddish vocabulary apparently was absolutely wonderful. But in terms of modern current members, I think that I was quite humbled by some of the things that people had achieved in spite of some quite profound disabilities. There was one woman, for example, who had been the doctor for Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, and another Jewish member who had been married to a serial Jewish criminal in the East End of London. So the fascination was absolutely huge.
Is the club you talked about originally, is there any remnants of it left?
Oh, of the Out and About Club?
Yeah.
Oh yes, it's still operating. It's been a bit in abeyance during COVID, of course, but it was very much alive and kicking. My husband and I regularly used to go to meetings to entertain the club with stories of our travels, and people were very, very much still involved in it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, we've now worked our way to Golders Green.
Yes, this was very much, I think, my breakthrough book. In terms of getting...
Sorry to interrupt, Pam. I'll say that Diana is unmuted if you wanted her to share any thoughts.
Oh yes, you're there.
I am here. Yes. Well, no. Thank you very much. No, I think Pam has sort of covered the main point about the changes in disability. The only thing I would add is that the club was started by a group of us when we were students. I mean, there wasn't really anybody who set it up who was sort of older than 21, 22 at the time. And certainly, and Pam can probably comment on it further, the kind of rules and regulations today under health and safety didn't exist then, and some of the things that we were doing, I think Pam must have made your hair stand on end when you heard about it.
Yes, so you're physically kind of removing people in and out of rooms and in and out of cars and things.
That's right. With no training, no anything. We were students. That's how it started. So I think that was as a social history, there was a lot in that book, showing social changes, definitely.
I think the two things that came across, Diana, was that it was pretty mutual. Although it was set up with the aim of helping people with disabilities, I think as young people, you got as much out of it as the people with disabilities. It's very much a mutual relationship. And also I was very taken by how the club had such a high profile and brought in volunteers or helpers, as you called themselves, from a wide range of backgrounds, both Jewish backgrounds, but also faith backgrounds as well. It really kind of struck a chord at that time in Jewish history.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Right, so we're on Golders Green.
On Golders Green, back to Golders Green. How this book came about was that back in 2013, Michael and I moved to Golders Green, bought an apartment there, and I was very, very struck by this very vibrant community that I found ourselves living in. And I wanted to know a little bit more, because I'm a curious historian, about how the community had grown up there and how it had changed over time. And I went looking for a book about it and discovered, to my shock horror, there was nothing had ever been written about the Jews of Golders Green. So I decided that this was something I needed to do. And over the next 18 months, I set about writing the book. The book that emerged was in two parts. There was a kind of chronological history of the community, decade by decade. And then in part two, a look at different aspects of Jewish life in Golders Green, a look at the shuls, a look at the shops, very important, a look at education and where people worked and so on. I did over 100 interviews for the book. Some of those were people's life stories. Others were where I approached people where I thought that they had particular knowledge of something like, say, for example, education. And the book that emerged was really quite successful. The learning here for me was about something which I'd call permissions. With previous books, because I'd been commissioned to write the books and people knew why I was there and why they were being interviewed. This was much more about talking to people that didn't know me, didn't know my credentials, didn't know how the material would be used, and therefore I decided that I really needed some kind of system for getting people's buy-in to use the information that they'd shared with me. So I was very, very conscientious about both sharing the interviews that I carried out with them, and then when I came to write the material into the book, showing them where they were being quoted and where the information was being used. And I think that produced a book that was therefore much more owned by the community. It wasn't about me imposing my views of history of Golders Green, but much more kind of co-produced with people. And if I'm also honest as well, did create a kind of an expectant audience to buy the book when it was eventually released. Yes, what I'm going to do now is hand over to Michael to share some of the stories in the book. I was really privileged to talk to some people who are amazing storytellers. And one of those was a character called Jeff Alexander. And he talked to me about Dunstan Road Shul, the first synagogue in Golders Green, and how he'd been a young person involved in the shul just after the war. And the story goes like this.
My grandfather often took me to Dunstan Road Synagogue. He went to the main service. I was supposed to go to the children's service, but sometimes instead, I got a bus up Brent Street to the Classic Cinema in Hendon to see Laurel and Hardy Flash Gordon and the like. There was just enough time to get back to Dunstan Road before the service came out. One day, I got caught out. My grandfather asked me how the children's service had gone. I said, okay, same as usual. My grandfather said, that's funny. I heard there wasn't a children's service today.
So this character called Jeff Alexander, who went on to be quite a successful businessman, pops up quite a few times in the book, telling stories such as this. I don't know if anybody came to the launch of the Golders Green book at Jewish Care back in 2016, but Jeff was the chap who sat on the second row and snored all the way through my presentation of the book. When I talk to people about Golders Green, the one thing that everybody mentioned was the shops of Golders Green. And I quickly understood at one time, this was a big feature, some very classy shops along Golders Green Road. And I don't know if anybody can guess which was the one shop that everybody mentioned without fail. Any clues on that one? Muted. Well, it was Frank's lingerie shop in Golders Green Road, which was run by B. Franks, who was quite a character. And later on, it was run by her daughter, Hazel Sheldon, who'd married Maurice Sheldon. And when I interviewed Maurice Sheldon, he told me this story.
When I first knew the Franks family, nylons were scarce. In the 1950s, there used to be a delivery to Golders Green on a Thursday. They came down by taxi from Shaftesbury Avenue, where the Franks had a warehouse with their shop. The delivery consisted of substandard nylon stockings, no tights in those days, and a limited supply of perfect ones. People knew we sold them on, this really is true, on a Saturday morning, and they used to queue from 6 o'clock. One enterprising man used to even sell tea and coffee to the people while they were queuing.
And I got a lovely picture of this man who used to wheel his barrow up and down the lines of people waiting to buy their stockings. I thought there was a lot packed into this small quote. I mean, you get a kind of flavour of history in terms of kind of stockings, not tights, but also Jewish history. Kind of, it just wouldn't happen today, the shops being open in Golders Green. But also I love this kind of insight into kind of Jewish enterprise, this man wheeling his barrow up and down Golders Green Road. Later on, when Hazel Sheldon took over the shop, she continued with a lot of the long-standing customers from the store. And Michael always tells me that this is one of his favourite stories in the book.
I remember one older woman who came into the shop just once a year to stock up on her wardrobe. When she was 99, she came in and she bought rather more clothes than usual. She confided in me, "I've spent rather more than I intended. I've decided it's not worth saving for my old age."
Am I to say something?
Yes.
I think that I'm not sure what my wife's going to say, but I think that I probably have met every single woman that's ever worked in Frank's.
Is that your claim to fame?
Absolutely.
As you can imagine, a lot of the stories that appear in the book are quite amusing, like that. I particularly like the ones about the parking and driving habits of the Jews of Golders Green, which is quite a constant theme. But also some of the stories are very, very poignant, and I don't think any are more poignant than the one that relates to somebody called Martin Sulzbacher.
Mr. Sulzbacher was a refugee from Dusseldorf. He owned a bookshop at 4 Sneath Avenue and was fortunate enough to survive the infamous sinking of the Arandora Star, which was carrying many interned Jewish people to Canada. While others perished, Mr. Sulzbacher managed to survive in the water until he was rescued. He attributed this to his portly physique, which allowed him to float for longer than others. But having survived this ordeal, Mr. Sulzbacher was then sent to Australia on the SS Dunera, where he endured terrible physical conditions and ill treatment. He told his survival story, but he failed to mention the great sadness that awaited him when he arrived back home. His parents, his entire extended family, had all been killed in the Blitz.
And if that has left people quite depressed, I'd like to say that there is a lovely follow-up story to this, which I uncovered by interviewing somebody who turned out to be Mr. Sulzbacher's niece. And it goes like this. When he came over, Mr. Sulzbacher brought his resources with him in the form of gold coins. And when he was interned, he buried the coins in his garden, the garden of his house where he lived. When he came back from Australia, he couldn't remember where he'd buried the coins, and they remained buried for many years until 2007, when somebody bought the house in which Mr. Sulzbacher had lived and buried the coins, and did a major rehab of the garden and discovered the gold coins and was honest enough to turn them in. They were returned to the Sulzbacher family and were used to make Sifrit Torah, which is just a lovely follow-up story from a very, very poignant tale. David, your turn.
I've got a question actually from Barbara and Andrew Shirley, and what they're asking, they're saying, how do you find the people to interview? Are they nominated by the shul, or do you attend the shul or group and get chatting? Do you include all the people you interview? I think that's part of what we did before.
Is this in relation to just Golders Green or in general? Because it has varied very much.
Well, I think it started off with the shul before, but I think it can carry on into Golders Green definitely.
Yeah, with the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, I actually looked at the membership, and I wanted to, it was actually me kind of selecting people who I thought would be quite representative. I wanted to get a mixture of long-standing members, new members, people of various ages, people who'd come to the synagogue in a variety of ways, perhaps from different backgrounds. So that's how I did it in terms of the membership. The Golders Green book, I call it the snowball effect, is that I had a few people in mind who I knew Golders Green, and every time I interviewed somebody, they referred me to at least a dozen other people who they thought I needed to interview. So that wasn't in any way planned. I kind of started, and then it just grew and grew. Yeah.
Okay. I've got a couple of notes here. Oh, my cousin Faye, she said Hazel Sheldon's daughter is a member of Belmont. Does that mean anything to you?
At Belmont Synagogue?
Yeah, Belmont Synagogue.
Yes. Unfortunately, Hazel Sheldon died earlier this year.
Oh,
very sad.
I'm sorry about that. Okay, the Howard and Naomi Youngerwood, they've got their hands up somewhere.
Hi.
Oh, great.
Thank you. Pam, I much enjoyed your book, having gone to Golders Green at the age of 5 until I was 25. So all these shops and memories was wonderful. One note of caution, and in a sense you touched on it when you were talking about speaking to 10 Jews and getting 10 different opinions, which can be very funny, but which I suppose has its dangers. Now, although I read your book some time ago, and I'm not getting any younger, I remember being taken aback. This is not a criticism, just I remember being taken aback by a quote you had about what was going on at Hendon County Grammar School, where, as you know, many of us are still in the area. A very happy school. I'm part of a group which meet every few years. We get about 70 or 80% of people still from my year who left in 1964. And the majority, you're never going to get unanimity, of course, the majority were also taken aback by a quote in the book. So my point is this: when you do in your book, as you have to, put some sort of criticism or something which could be controversial, to what extent are you aware of the danger that that opinion may not be an accurate one, if I may put it in that way?
Okay. I'm very, very aware of that. And I use what I call triangulation. When I come across something which I think is quite controversial and could quite upset people, I check it out. I take what somebody's told me in one interview and check it out further on. And I only put things in when I think that actually there's enough evidence to say that there actually was an issue. And in some cases, I think I used another technique, is that when I thought that actually mentioning it in the main text may have actually detracted from the book and actually caused some people to stop reading, but nevertheless it needed to be mentioned. I've mentioned the issue in a footnote rather than in the main text. As a historian, I take the view that it's really wrong to try and cover up things which are controversial, and almost undermines your credibility if you don't mention something that everybody knows happened. But taking your point, I do it very, very carefully, very advisedly, and only having checked things out from other sources. Yeah.
Oh, he's been mute. Can you unmute? Can you unmute Howard again? I think he's talking. Howard? Phil? Howard?
Yeah, I pressed it. I'm just.
Oh, oh no,
he's muted himself. What's that?
I can't get it.
Oh, Howard, sorry, we missed your beginning.
Right. They're all trying to silence me. Look, I take your point, Pam. I don't want to take over the meeting, but there are a hell of a lot of ex-Hendon County people around. You say you check, I fully accept this, roughly how many ex-Hendon County pupils going over them did you speak to check any particular, if that's not too difficult a question?
I can't remember, but it would have been more than half a dozen, I should think, yeah. Well,
then I'm surprised. If ever there's going to be a further edition, come back to me.
I will, okay. I'll do that.
I've got a statement actually from Phil Singer, and I'm not quite sure what he means by this, but I'm sure a lot of you will know. And his statement is Blooms.
Yeah, that was an answer to the earlier question of which place in Golders Green. I was wrong.
Yeah, there's a whole section of the book, about 3 or 4 pages, I think, that's dedicated to Blooms and the stories of the waiters. Yeah.
As the question which is often asked, which came first, Blooms or Franks?
I think it was actually Blooms, yeah.
Out of interest, when did Jews first settle in Golders Green?
The very first resident, I actually spent a disproportionate amount of time looking for the first Jew in Golders Green, and I got it back to, I think it was 1894, the very first Jew to come to Golders Green. But it was really noticeable only after the coming of the Underground in 1907, when it made it possible for Jews to be able to get there, and more importantly at that time, get back to their places of work. Yeah.
What was it about Golders Green that made them gravitate towards that area?
I think it was a mixture of both push and pull factors. The push was kind of the East End was becoming increasingly overcrowded, less attractive. But I think the pull was kind of Jews were beginning to assimilate into mainstream, and they really wanted to kind of live where other people lived. And at that time, Golders Green was kind of very quickly getting a reputation for being a middle class kind of place, a kind of new kind of area with nice housing, nice green spaces, good transport, etc. So I think that attracted a lot of Jewish people.
Why? And I can't. I've tried to work this out. Why is it that women park 3 cars deep in Golders Green Road, especially at the other end on a Friday?
Or outside the chemist, I can't remember what the chemist was called, on after Motzi Shabbat. It was about 4 deep. I don't know if people know there used to be a lovely plaque above the pharmacy. They're saying, I don't care if you're double parked, you stand in line like everybody else.
But they don't. There's no such thing as queuing, is there? It's like being in Israel. I mean, queues just don't exist there. I mean, Edgeworth's getting towards that, but not quite as bad. So
your question didn't seem sexist, David. That's what men do in Edgware. They triple park it. The men triple park in Edgware. So.
Yeah, but that's all right, isn't it? Your book, this book, that was reprinted quite a few times, wasn't it? Why do you think this book was so popular?
I think just because there's so many people who one way or another have been connected to Golders Green, either lived there, worked there, shopped there, or congregated outside Golders Green Station on a Saturday night. If anybody was part of that scene at one time. And also there's been quite a turnover of people. People moved on quite quickly often, so it just added to the numbers of people who'd been acquainted with Golders Green in some way. Yeah.
Okay.
It surprised me when it suddenly took off in Israel. I've been sort of steadily getting kind of commission for the book, and there was a sudden spike, and I discovered that it had got into Steinmatsky's at Tel Aviv airport, which is very good.
Yeah. Okay.
Somebody's just left a message to say Frank's was open before Bloom's, but then I expect, unless we know the years that either of them did, then.
I meant Bloom's was open in the East End before it came to Golders Green. And Bloom's in Golders Green didn't open till I think it was 1960. Frank's opened in 1937 in Golders Green.
Oh, okay.
Bloom's must have opened later than 1960, surely.
Not in Golders Green. It opened much earlier in the East End, of course.
The East End was
came to Golders Green in 1960. Yeah.
I didn't realise it was that. I thought it was much later than that. Don't remember. Okay.
No, it was definitely there around that time.
We now have the food department.
Shall we move on to Rinkoffs, David?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I can see one Rinkoff, maybe a few there.
How many Rinkoffs?
Derek. Hi, Derek.
There's actually a connection between the Golders Green book and the Rinkoff story. It's called History in the Baking, the Rinkoff story. I think it was nearly 50 talks about the Golders Green book, and quite a few of those were ones for the AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees, organised by Esther Rinkoff. I think I did about 10, which Esther organised, and I got to know her and stayed in touch with her after the talks, and I met up with her early last year, 2019, and she told me that she was about to embark on doing walking tours based on the history of the Rinkoff family, and she shared with me some of the stories relating to the family, and I thought, this is just beautiful social history and worthy of a book. And we explored that further. I went on one of her walking tours and ended up at the bakery, and that just sold it, really. And within a month, I was working on the history of the Rinkoff bakery in the East End. I interviewed people across the family, just about every member still around. I also talked to customers, to suppliers, to staff members, and it produced a very, very rounded history. The book describes how the bakery, which was started by Hyman Rinkoff in 1911, developed from being largely a neighborhood bakery serving immigrant Jews, eventually became a very, very high profile institution, a big both retail and wholesale bakery, and one serving not just Jews, but a very vibrant multicultural community. The history of the bakery is set against changes in the bakery industry generally, but also really brings out the move of Jews from the East End to other parts of London. And I like to think of it as kind of the mirror image of the Golders Green book. The Rinkoff story is about people leaving, and the Golders Green book is about people arriving. And there's lots of kind of parallels between the two books. The challenge on this particular book was that there was very little archival material relating to the bakery. It is almost exclusively based on my interviews with people. When you have material from lots of sources, you can kind of develop a framework into which the stories and anecdotes can slot. But here I had to kind of weave a story from the stories and the memories, and it was a lot more challenging because of that, to weave together people's memories and stories. I'd like to introduce just a few stories from the book, a few extracts. After Hyman founded the bakery, there was a point at which his children began to work there as part of the business. But by the 1940s, the beginning of the war, a few of the family members were starting to want to open their own businesses and were no longer working full time. And Hyman was therefore employing external bakers to make the bread. One of the people that I interviewed for the book was somebody called Laura Keefe Softness, who is the oldest grandchild of Hyman Rinkoff, and her memories were absolutely amazing. She had very detailed recollections of Hyman and Fanny, his wife, of all the children, and how the bakery operated. Even she remembered the name of the bakery cat. But she did tell me about these bakers that worked in the bakery during the 1940s. There were two, and they were both called Moishi. There was an older Moishi who was smaller, and a younger Moishi, who was very involved in the London Jewish Bakers Union. People may know about the very famous banner for the Bakers Union that's in the Jewish Museum in Camden. And Laura told me this story about the smaller, older Moishi.
In the bakery, there was a big machine for mixing the dough. It was very old and it kept on breaking down. When this happened, little Moishi, who looked just like the small man that Benny Hill used to pat on the head, used to take off his shoes and socks, and he used to knead the bread with his bare feet. This was the dough for the sour bread called sovra in Yiddish. He always wore a dirty apron, which he hopefully took off before he got into the mixing bowl.
So if you want to talk about health and safety, as we did with the Out and About book, I think there was a big issue here. What was interesting for me is that as I interviewed people, it just didn't tell me about the history of the bakery, but very much the context in which it operated, the evolution of the East End, and the gradual dispersal of the Jewish community. By the 1950s, 1960s, the bakery was serving not just the remaining Jewish people in the East End, but it was attracting a steady number of non-Jewish customers, amongst whom there were the infamous Cray brothers. And here's a story about them.
The Cray twins used to go into the bakery at Old Montague Street quite often. They placed their orders, asked for their purchases to be added to their account, but they never settled their account, and it gradually mounted up to several £100s. In the end, Jack Kay from Rinkoffs, who'd been a boxer in the army, decided he was going to go and ask for his money. He went to the Blind Beggar pub, where he spotted one of the Cray brothers, and he said he wanted his account paid. The Cray twin said that as Jack had been very brave coming and asking for the money, he was going to pay the bill. And he peeled off the money from a wad of notes and he handed it straight over to Jack.
Any questions about that book? Don't know whether Derek wants to come in at all about it.
Derek?
While you were looking into that book, did you also look at the Goldring Bakery as well?
No.
Which was around there?
No, I mean, I only went wider in looking at kind of the baking industry and what was happening there, but not any particular institution.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I know, Derek, did you want to speak? Can you
I've unmuted him. Yeah, I've pressed the button.
Okay. Hi, Pam.
Hi, nice to hear you.
Yeah, how are you? You okay?
Thank you.
Just to say what a great job you did. I mean, the book is fantastic. Whoever reads it loves it, and the whole warmth of it, it's just fab. It's something that we really treasure, and thank you for. Some of the stories, loads of things that I didn't know, and I certainly didn't know the beginning of the history. I'm so thankful for it. It's just great, and I recommend it to anybody. It's just a real family story. It was a little bit of a vanity project, but I just think it was just fab. We love it. Thank you very much.
Derek, does that mean we all get a discount when we go down there?
With pleasure.
Rabbi Shlomo Crichton put his hand up somewhere along the line.
Yeah, I've just unmuting. There we go.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to come back on this question about Bloom's in the East End. My mother's parents of blessed memory had a very similar establishment in Stoke Newington. They opened in 1923, and by that date, Evelyn and Maury Bloom had an established presence in the East End.
Yes, I think that's right. So I was making the difference between when Bloom started in the East End and when it moved across to Golders Green.
Yes, I took that point.
Yeah.
I've got a question for you. What contribution do you think that the Rinkoff book made to Jewish history?
Oh, I think there are numerous books, very academic ones, a lot of them, which describe the kind of dispersal of the old Jewish East End and how people gradually assimilated into mainstream and moved about in London. But for me, it really, really brought that story alive, seeing it happen through one particular family. In the book, you follow the family from one generation to the next, how they became more assimilated, how they moved into different spheres of life, how they kind of branched out and changed their kind of identity in a way. And I think that that's so infinitely more powerful than reading a kind of a book about facts, figures, trends, etc. I think that that's its real contribution, talking about it as a case study. Much more interesting, and at a kind of more personal level, it was very gratifying to see how the book brought together a family that was quite dispersed. Different members of the family live abroad in different places. There are kind of different generations that haven't spoken for a while for various reasons. So it's very nice to see that the book was a stimulus to bring about a kind of family dialogue. Derek might want to talk about the launch in Whitechapel, where the family all came together, and it was just a wonderful, very emotional event. Yeah. So that's what oral history can do. It can unite.
Okay. Anything else with the East End? I mean, because the East End, I mean, it's a lifetime on its own, isn't it? I mean, my parents came from the East End. I'm sure that most people here, their parents came from the East End, and it was just, well, it's certainly a different world than it is today, isn't it? But it was amazing because all most of our grandparents all start, well, us Londoners anyway, we all started down there, didn't we? And whenever I go to the East End, I've just got there's just a feeling about it. I never actually lived there, but it's just got some je ne sais quoi there. It's a wonderful place. It's changing, but Anyway, shall we now go down to the South Coast?
And let's go to the South Coast. For the last 9 months, I think it is, I've been working quite solidly on my latest book, which is about the Jewish hotels of Bournemouth. And there's a link, that kind of theme through my books, really. When I was doing interviews for the Golders Green book, I spoke to numerous people who told me, and I met my partner at a Jewish hotel in Bournemouth, and it occurred to me that this really was kind of quite a story and something to be investigated. And when we got to this year and got to lockdown, and I suddenly had a kind of opportunity to write, I started looking at this, and I just thought, oh, what a great book to write, and one that really lends itself to an oral history approach. So what I've got now, which is off to the publishers next week, is a book that talks about the evolution of the Jewish hotels in Bournemouth. It doesn't just look at the big names that most people will be aware of, like the Green Park, the Cumberland, the Majestic, and so on, but also brings in the much smaller establishments, the small guest houses and the some of the smaller hotels as well. So it's a very kind of comprehensive book. As well as charting the rise and decline of the hotels, it looks at particular aspects of hotel life, such as the food, the religious aspects of the hotel, the entertainment, and so on. And it's been an utter delight to write. I think I've done 118 interviews over the course of the last 9 months, which is a record for me. And just as a kind of sample of the stories that have come out, Michael's going to do just a few readings for me. Basically, the first hotels or boarding houses, as they were called, started to appear in Bournemouth at the end of the 19th century. But really started to take off in the years before and after the First World War, where they evolved from being kind of small boarding houses to ever more luxurious and larger hotels. catering for a kind of wider variety of people. At the end of the Second World War, by then all of what we call the Big Eight, all those big luxurious hotels were on the scene, but there was still quite an array of smaller guest houses. Some of them were kind of running fast to catch up with the new standards. I had a call from a woman about June time, I think, saying that she didn't actually want to be interviewed, but she had a story for me. Was I interested? I said, well, tell me the story. And it was just perfect.
My parents went to Bournemouth for their honeymoon in 1946. They stayed in one of the guest houses there. My father was deaf, but one of his great pleasures in life was eating. The food in the guest house, however, was awful. He decided he couldn't stay there any longer. So my parents went upstairs. My father asked if he could borrow my mother's lipstick. He used it to paint dots on his face and round his neck. And then he went back downstairs to explain to the guest house owner they had to leave because he wasn't feeling very well. The owner was only too pleased to see them go. So anyway, they packed up and they moved to the Green Park. After they'd settled in, they went down to have dinner. And while they were eating, to their absolute horror, they noticed that the guest house owner that they just left was also in the dining room having dinner. They were so embarrassed about it, but then they thought that the owner obviously didn't like his own food either.
The hotels all prided themselves on giving the best service possible to their guests and being kind of orientated to their individual needs. But it's quite clear from many of the stories that there were some quite tough customers that the hoteliers had to deal with. Barbara Glynn, who is the daughter of the people that owned the Green Park, told me this story.
So one lady customer phoned up and she spoke to my Auntie Ray. She liked coming for the first 2 weeks in June. Auntie Ray pointed out this year Shavuos would fall during that period. Knowing this lady wouldn't want to be there for the festival and pay the extra cost that was involved, she suggested another time for her to come and stay. After a very prolonged argument, my aunt said, "Perhaps you'd like me to phone the chief rabbi and ask him to move the date of Shavuos this year." The customer said, "Oh, yes, please, would you?"
One of the things that became evident quite early on is just the sheer number of things that can go wrong when you're running a hotel. And this story, which is the last one that we're going to be telling, is an illustration. Hang on in there because it's not a short story.
It's a bit like Fawlty Towers, this one. I remember once when Mr. Mimo was on holiday, Maria and I were left in charge of the hotel. Customer came up to me and said, "Nino, I'm coming in September. I want a birthday cake. Please don't wait for us to finish dinner. Bring the cake as soon as we sit down and give our order." So I went to the pastry chef, told him I needed the birthday cake for 6 people when the guests was coming back. On the day of the birthday, the restaurant was full. I said to Mario, "Go and get the cake straight away." He went off, but he didn't come back. I left everything to see what was happening. I shouldn't have done it because I was in charge, but I found Mario in the patisserie. He said, "I can't find the cake. It's nowhere to be seen." I said to myself, "What do I do now?" I went down to the kitchen where the Polish chef Nicky was working. He wasn't too bad with cakes. I told him, "Nicky, drop everything. You're going to make a cake." I left him to it. I returned to the restaurant. Time passed. The cake still didn't arrive. I went back to the kitchen to find out what was happening. Nicky told me he didn't know how to write "Happy Birthday." I showed him how to melt some chocolate and use the icing tube to write "Happy Birthday." but he even forgot the H and he wrote happy birthday. With a palette knife, I removed the lettering, spread on another layer of buttercream, and I wrote happy birthday on a piece of paper for him to follow. Back in the restaurant, people were starting to leave. Still, the cake didn't arrive. I went back to the kitchen once more to see if the cake was ready, which it was. Maria picked it up, opened the door, and dropped the cake on the floor. I was now sweating with panic. We put the cake back together, took it to the restaurant. The band was having a break. The room was deserted, apart from the table of 6 people waiting for the cake. We all started singing, "Happy birthday to you." The guest who'd ordered the cake looked at it and he said, "Looks a bit like it's been on the floor." I said, "How did you guess?" He laughed. Otherwise, he'd have had to kill me.
So Faulty Towers was invented here.
Absolutely. It's actually, we're well gone 9 o'clock.
Yeah, I was going to say last questions.
I know, it's just, I'll give you one last question. What struck you about the history of the hotels?
In a nutshell, how much people can eat. There's a whole chapter about the eating and dining experience in the Jewish hotels, and it takes up about a third of the book. I don't know if anybody in the audience ever stayed in one of the Jewish hotels in Bournemouth, but it seemed to me like it was non-stop eating from early morning through to kind of midnight, in case you couldn't make it through to breakfast. And worse than that, even if people weren't actually eating, they were thinking or talking about food. So it's just amazing. It's a kind of today, it just wouldn't happen. The other thing was about the role of women. There were a lot of the hotels were run by very, very powerful women. I don't know if anybody knew the characters such as Blumenfeld in the Cumberland or Faye Schneider at the Majestic, but they were called collectively the Grand Dame of Bournemouth. And I think are worthy of at least an article on their own, because they were so feisty, and I'd like to have met them really. So those women really did stick out. The other thing was about the smaller hotels, which I mentioned, that a low kind of people were sort of very taken with the luxury of the larger hotels. There were some really lovely stories attached to the smaller ones. Once you got into them, there were some great characters who ran them, and there's some kind of very individual stories about how they ended up running guest houses. Just an example of that is that I identified that at one point there were about half a dozen small guest houses that were run by former continental refugees who'd made their way to Bournemouth, and they operated these small guest houses which particularly catered for other former refugees. They advertised themselves as providing continental atmosphere and continental food, and they spoke German as well, so that was really quite interesting. Yeah. So any more questions?
I was going to say that part of the reason, and please no complaints of this, is said somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but the reason why fewer people are going to shore at the moment is not because of the virus, it's because there's no Kiddush. And they do it. We do enjoy our food. And just to add on to that, my parents were married during the war. They married in August 44, and they spent their honeymoon at the Green Park.
Oh, wonderful. There must be one of the first guests in that case. Yeah, talking about the Kiddushim is that there's a whole section about them because they were absolutely huge. Just before a 4-course lunch, there was these kind of full banquet Kiddushim, and apparently quite dangerous affairs that people came out of shul in the hotels and just headed for these banquets, and you had to be very careful not to get trampled on in the rush, or not to get your hands speared by somebody reaching for the food.
You know, you wouldn't see that in a Goyish hotel, would you?
They were talking about when Kiddushim starts again, that the cholent will be served with social distancing, with the beans in one corner, the potatoes in another corner, and the meat in the car park.
Yeah, actually, Derek Winkoff has just sent us a message, which was actually shown in our short a few months ago now, and that there was a documentary on the Green Park Hotel itself.
Yes, I use that quite a bit. Very good. Yeah.
That was just, if you haven't seen it, and you've been to the Green Park, even if you haven't been to the Green Park, it's certainly something very, very different. It's like a different era, isn't it? It just doesn't happen like that now.
In fact, the Glynn family lived in Golders Green. They lived in Hoop Lane, so there was a tie in there as well.
Well, I think it was. I want to thank you very, very much. We didn't. I mean, it was really. I mean, you could have actually gone on. You could have spoken to the East End for hours, and you could have carried with Golders Green. But you know, we have to make stops in here and there. So thank you very, very much, both of you, and hopefully we'll see you again.
Indeed.
with your next book. Have you finished the hotel books?
I finished the hotel. Yes, it goes to the publisher next week. Yeah.
Oh, so it's not. We can't get it yet.
No, in about 4 months' time, I should think. Yeah.
Okay, well, I hope you sell lots and lots of them. I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will. So thank you very much again. And David, have you got anything about next week?
Yes, next Wednesday evening, again, thank you all for being here this evening. And obviously, thank you to Pam and to Michael for the presentation, the talk this evening. Most enjoyable. Next week, we have Charles Golding, who used to live in Edgware. He's now his 4th anniversary in Israel. He is a broadcaster, he is a journalist as well, and he will be joining us from Israel next week by the magic of Zoom. Before we go, I would like to again thank you all for being here and to wish each and every one of you and your families a very happy and healthy new year, and please God that next year is a way better year than this year.
Yeah, it can't be worse, can it? And drive carefully. It's very, very icy out there. So, good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to end the live stream now, but I will allow people to unmute themselves. So if you want to unmute and want to talk,
yeah.
There we go. So yeah, unmute is available if you'd like to share any thoughts.
A lot of them are still muted. Have they got to do it themselves?
They can do it themselves, yeah. So if people want to, yeah.
Who's still left? I'm trying to have a look. Oh, there's quite a lot.